The 1970s were a golden era for progressive rock music, spawning lasting staples of the genre like Genesis, King Crimson, Yes, and Jethro Tull. But one band among them was particularly unique and experimental, and that band was Gentle Giant. Even though they were only active for 10 years between 1970 and 1980, they released 11 studio albums, a ton of live recordings from all around the world, and they left a lasting legacy of stellar musicianship that remains unique and unmatched to this day. So what makes Gentle Giant prog? Let's take a listen. Gentle Giant's first self-titled album was released in 1970, placing them among the first wave of prog rock greats along with Pink Floyd's Atom Heart Mother, Genesis's Trespass, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer's self-titled debut, all released that year. The Gentle Giant album introduced us to many of the aspects that we'd come to associate with the band: complex and winding melodic sections, varied instrumentation, thick harmony, and the central Gentle Giant character, who was inspired by Renaissance author Francois Rabelais' comical giant Gargantua. Later albums would only increase the instrumental variety, supplementing the typical rock guitar, bass, drums, and keyboards with instruments like saxophone, recorder, clarinet, trumpet, mellotron, ukulele, mandolin, xylophone, mellophone, vibraphone, all manner of percussion, and of course, the viola. Seriously, between the main Shulman brothers and the rest of the band, these guys could play just about anything. And that's Exhibit 1 for what makes Gentle Giant prog. They were able to play so many different instruments and incorporate them so well with so much proficiency into their music. David Zammit, who was a sound engineer for several of their albums, even created an instrument that the band would play. It was called the shoalberry, a sort of 3-stringed ukulele made using a pickup from an old instrument that the band had laying around. As progressive and interesting as their first album was, they would only go further into mixing genres with rock, folk, classical and chamber music, medieval, baroque, a cappella, and jazz. It wasn't atypical for prog bands around this time to mix genres like this, but very few did it so radically across their various albums and even within individual songs. One notable influence on Gentle Giant was a strong classical music influence, from song structures resembling those in various classical musics like Baroque, chamber music, and medieval music, to the instrumentation that included instruments more commonly seen in classical, brass band, or ensemble music. Gentle Giant wasn't alone in using this kind of classical instrumentation. There were plenty of bands who had done it before, like the Moody Blues, or even the Beatles, and King Crimson, who were doing it around the same time. However, they were unique in the way that they implemented them. They took compositional techniques that were unusual in rock music at the time, like counterpoint, polyphony, and hocketing. They were able to work these styles of composition into rock music in a way that had never been done before. For example, hocketing is the use of alternating voices which complete a melodic line across various separate musicians, and that's a technique that goes back to medieval times. Though there was plenty of call and response sections in rock music, there wasn't quite something that sounded like this. Another notable and unique aspect of their music is their original use of vocal harmonies. Most members of the band would lend their voices to orchestrate lush harmony, sometimes strange and polyphonic, borrowing notes from several keys at the same time. Carrie Manier's lead vocal lines were bold and unique. A melody might jump around irregardless of key or the melodic conventions of typical rock music. Far from writing catchy, hooky lines, a Gentle Giant melody has a way of taking you into strange and unknown territory, and yet it still has a way of getting stuck in your head, if only for it sounding like nothing you've ever heard before. Another contributing factor to their progginess was their frequent changes in tempo and time signatures, including incredibly syncopated rhythms and polymeters, where they would play multiple time signatures over each other at different tempos, which interlocked. This is the kind of pioneering rhythmic texture that musicians would look back 2 years later, and it still hasn't been fully explored to this day. Though you could hear the influence on bands throughout the 70s and 80s, and even more modern bands like Tool and Meshuggah. As the 70s went on, the lyrics started to come into line with the musical complexity of the band. The complex multi-part harmonies supported complex lyrical concepts ranging from fantasy, politics, and of course the literature of Francois Rabelais. They began to make concept albums with 1972's Three Friends, and they used the album format to tell continuous stories across the songs. These were pretty varied in concept, with Three Friends being about three school children who grow up and follow their various paths through life. One grows to become a road digger, one an artist, and one a white-collar worker who can no longer understand each other's lifestyles. Later concept albums like The Power and the Glory were about headier topics, like power and corruption. Their 1976 album Interview was a concept album critiquing the music industry's reliance on marketing, a problem that definitely still persists to today. Albums with vivid storylines, characters, and concepts would become more and more typical throughout the 70s for progressive rock musicians. Basically, as far as progressive rock goes, Gentle Giant was the whole package. They had complex musicianship, intricate musical ideas, intelligent and verbose lyrical concepts, varied instrumentation, unique melodies, and a blend of different genres that progress rock into uncharted territory. Gentle Giant is most definitely prog. Thank you for joining me and taking a look at one of the most classic prog bands of the 70s. If you had a good time, hit the like button and subscribe, because we're going to be looking at more bands and asking the question, is it prog?